Start recording. All right, thank you all. And so today we have a very special guest, as I mentioned, Ethan, the Senior Vice President of Design at Slack, where he leads a team focused on crafting products that help people's working lives simpler, more pleasant, and more productive. So prior to Slack, Ethan works at a couple of companies that I'm a huge fan of. Specifically, Ethan has led the Airbnb's design team focused on home sharing, which was responsible for majorities of Airbnb revenue today and the core Airbnb experience. And before that, Ethan was also the head of design at Uber and the head of commerce design at Google, where he led teams in designing and launching a number of transportation, shopping, travel, payment product experiences. So at work, Ethan is inspired by two core goals, first of which is to ship software that has powerful and positive impact on people and society. And second is to cultivate people's career, helping them grow in healthy and happy ways. And I can personally attest to that because Ethan was the one who tied up the entire partnership for ADPList and Slack, and in which we are incredibly grateful for his leadership throughout this entire time. So Ethan, thank you for joining us here today. And all of us can't wait to hear from you. So Ethan, I'm going to pass the mic on to you right now. Thank you.
Right on. Thanks, Felix. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Let me jump into presenter mode here so I can share my screen. So can everybody see that? Okay, cool. So let's kick it off. So I'm Ethan. Hello. I lead design at Slack, and I've been designing for over 23 years now, pretty long time. And what's great about that is it allows me to look back upon those 23 years of learning and growing and developing insights. And what's even cooler than that is the fact that I can actually share some of this with you today, which I feel really blessed to be able to do. So before I start, I just want to give a word of thanks and gratitude towards everybody here for sharing this space with me. Also to Felix and the ADPList crew. It just is a wonderful partnership, and I feel so privileged to be able to work closely with you all and to have Slack work more closely with you all as well. It's a wonderful community of folks that are all growing, which is obviously near and dear to my heart. And I'd also like to thank the team that helped prepare for this presentation. So I think I saw Skip in there. Thanks a lot, Skip, and James for helping help me with this presentation. I really appreciate it. And I'd also like to thank my dad and mom for bringing me into this world. Thank you, Mom and Dad. Okay, so before we get into my journey, I'd like to provide you with there's basically like a primary career framework mechanism that I oftentimes use. It's called the S-curve framework. It was recently sort of popularized in a post that somebody put online that I thought was really useful to think about career paths in general. So I think about this framework as I go through my talk. So what it looks like is something like this. When you're at the early part of your career, in your early sort of years, you're laying your foundation and you put some effort into that. Then you hit this point of acceleration. For me, that was around like age 26, 27 through like 40, 42 or so. It was like a really, really significant up ramp. And then, you basically have gained all of these skills and you gain all of these experiences. And I don't know if I've peaked in my career, but basically what I've actively sought at this point in my career is like, I'm actually not interested in having radically challenging new work experiences. I want to leverage what I've gained over the last 23 years. And instead, my focus now is on my family. I'm actually working for my parents' home in Orinda, and I'm somewhat of a caretaker for both of them. My kids are getting into their second decade of life, and I want to be there for them. And so for me, in terms of my focus on work, I'm trying to do things that I know I can do pretty well already. And then I'm really focusing on my life. So this is kind of like a model to think about your career, but also to think about your life. If you may have kids at a certain point, you may get married, have a partner and settle down at a certain point. You may buy a house at a certain point. All these things happen in your life. So anyway, just want to put this S-curve out there because this is something that I think about all the time. And what you'll find is that, and what I found is that basically this long S-curve is made up of these little S-curves, right? It's not like we have, one massive challenge that happens in the middle of our lives. Instead, we have essentially a set of significant challenges that happen repeatedly. Those build upon each other, and then you gain experience as they compound over time. So with that framework in mind, let's start with my journey. So I graduated from college in 1999, and fresh out of college, I moved down to Newport Beach. And I took a job at an educational startup called Achieva. And this Newport was away from all my friends who were in LA. And I just wanted to be like kind of alone and independent and learn more about myself. And then in terms of the job, it was just a job. I was still kind of searching for what I wanted to do. I got a bachelor's in philosophy and a minor in ceramics. So it really had nothing to do with like interaction design at that point. So I was just searching for myself. And mainly I wanted to be an architect. Frank Lloyd Wright was one of my idols, and he has been since I was a kid. But I wasn't exactly sure about that. So I did something that I guarantee will work for you if you're interested in sort of learning about careers. And I still do this. I just cold called folks to learn. And I cold called a local firm, and I volunteered to work for free in order to gain experience. And lucky for me, that firm actually agreed to allow me to work from 7 to 10 a.m. in the morning and pay me. And they respected my determination. So I basically filed papers for them from 7 till 8. Then I worked with an interior designer from 8 until 10. And I did that for about 3 months. And I watched how the drafts people worked, how the principal at the architect's firm worked, how the owners worked. And it was like a paid ethnographic assignment for me. And what I learned from that experience was that I didn't want to do that kind of work at that point in my life. And I also think about this graph, which you may have seen. I think this is a really great one because it sort of shows how in your life you have multiple branching pathways that are possible in terms of your path. And at any given point in time, you look backwards, there's n number of pathways that are no longer accessible. But when you look forward, there's a ton of other pathways that are accessible. So I made a decision at that point. I don't want to be an architect right now. Boom, I just eliminated a bunch of pathways, and I was able to sort of steer myself in a different direction. Okay, so the lesson though I learned here was be curious. And when mapping your career, don't hesitate to learn about your potential options and do your research. I've found that people are oftentimes very giving of their time, especially if you offer to interview them, because people naturally like to talk about themselves. So take advantage of that. Okay, so after that first experience, I moved up to the Bay Area. And that was pretty life-changing for me because in Newport Beach, I was genuinely depressed. I was trying to find myself by being alone, but I really am kind of an introvert. And so it was difficult for me to adjust and make friends. And so I moved to San Francisco, moved in with some friends, and I immediately felt like a sense of relief. And when I was in San Francisco, I got another job at another educational technology startup called Project Achieve. There's a lot of achievement in the startups at that time. I still didn't know what I wanted to do, but I just kept learning. So I went to the University of California, Berkeley's extended learning classes. I took classes in Java, systems administration, and user-centered design. And then I also started learning more about design, and I became really interested in information architecture. At my job at Achieva, I was somewhat of a generalist. I even set up servers at one point. But at Project Achieve, I started growing, and I got the opportunity to become an information architect there, and I was learning on the job. I didn't have teachers per se, but I had a community of people who were doing IA work. There was great blogs that were out there at the time. There was a lot of canonical books on IA that I was reading, and at night I just really consumed this stuff and applied it to work. And this also taught me a lesson, which is that you should fake it until you make it. And when you make it, the confidence that you gain strengthens a real muscle. And that muscle can then be applied to future challenges where you might not have 100% of the skills required to be immediately fully successful, but at least you have enough skills that you can learn your way towards your ultimate goal. And so I don't think faking it till you make it is a bad thing at all. I think it just means you're taking on a new challenge and you're learning as you go along. Okay, so eventually I decided it was time for like a real education design of some sort. So I followed my fascination with information architecture and applied to schools of library science. Thankfully, I got into Cal. That meant I wouldn't need to go somewhere and upend my life again and not be away from my friends, my stable spot. And then at the same time, a good friend from college, who I know is interested in design, who knew I was interested in design, got me in touch with Adobe for an internship. And so I interviewed there and I got the job. I finally had this job in design with an established company. That was my goal. And now I had manifested that goal and I was super overjoyed. And this also taught me a lesson, which is to make sure that your intentions are known. And by doing that, you can build a path towards a stronger network. And then that network can help you develop additional future paths down the line. So if more people know where you want to go, that notion of branching future paths proliferates because you have more potential opportunities because people know your intention. So I did an intern at the same time as going to grad school for the 2 years I was at Cal. And my main goal at the time was the internship because I ultimately wanted to work at a company like Adobe. But that didn't make my professors happy. And it really stressed me out because I was working 30 hours a week as an intern at Adobe. I probably should have pared back those hours, but the pay was good. And that's what I wanted to do in the first place. And then I worked an equivalent 30 hours a week, attending classes and doing homework in grad school. So that was about 60 hours a week. I didn't sleep a lot. It was super nuts. But I did graduate, and that felt really great and rewarding. And at the time, I wanted to see Cal through. But I had this job at Adobe, but if I prioritized work and left school early, that I might have had the confidence needed to move forward. I might have regretted it though. Ultimately, I'm glad I finished graduate school, and looking back, the value of grad school hasn't been as much as other work experiences, but I made good on my commitments. And what I found in my career is that you never know who your future boss or your future peer will be. It's a really small industry, and your reputation is critically important to maintain. And so a word of advice is always follow up on your commitments. If you say you're going to work somewhere and you make a decision to join a company or make a decision to go to grad school or do something, follow up on your commitments. I found that to be very successful. I've also seen people not follow up on their commitments as in my role, and I've not been super happy about it. So I can see the flip side. So when I graduated, I had this choice: stay at Adobe, or I had a job offer from Samsung, and I would move to Seoul. And I chose to stay at Adobe. And what I thought about was that first job that I had at Achieva in Newport Beach. And I thought about like that risk to going to Orange County. And that taught me that I needed to actually be around people who supported me and the friends that I made in the Bay Area. So instead of choosing Samsung, which would have been this incredible adventure, but most likely a very lonely one, I don't speak Korean, even though I learned a little bit. I chose Adobe. And in order for me to move forward at that point in my life, I just needed stability. I just wasn't ready for a risk, which also taught me a lesson to listen to yourself and also don't make the same mistakes twice. So I consider Adobe my first, real employer in design. It was a grown-up company, shipped real products used by creative professionals and knowledge workers across the world. I was super excited to learn. I started out working with the Acrobat team. I was their most junior designer, and I worked pretty hard on that. And I did that for about 3 years, and I found that I could learn everything that I could from Acrobat. And then I became antsy, and I wanted to take on new challenges. I don't know if you can see this resolution, but the image to the right here is the Acrobat Preferences dialog. It is probably I hope nobody here works at Adobe. It is one of the worst UIs in the world. I had to work on this thing a lot. It was horrible. So I was ready to move on from that. And by the way, if you open Acrobat today and open their Preferences dialog, it's the same thing. It's pretty crazy. So Acrobat's a powerful tool, as you can tell. So in any case, in 2005, Adobe acquired Macromedia. Along with that acquisition came a small team called the XD team. So this is the experience design team. They're a group of incredible Flash designers, and they were basically handpicked to innovate using Flash. So I started to meet with them, and it was clear that there was much more that I could learn from them versus on my current team at Adobe. So I set my sights on changing teams, and through a few months, I was able to eventually move over. So I treated that team like an internship, and so did the folks on that team. They treated me almost like an intern again, even though I was a full-time employee and I had been there for a few years. And so these designers that I was working with were just leagues more talented than I was. I mean, some of these folks built their own fonts. Some of them were fairly famous Flash designers back in the day. And I apprenticed myself to one of their best designers. And it was like this design school that I'd never actually gone to. I was just this sponge, and I was growing super rapidly. And I would take on any project they threw at me. And everything was going great. But my mentor was also super immature and super mean. And this was sort of in the mid-2000s, before codes of conduct at work were more fair and just and equitable and respectful. And there were times where I literally felt tormented at work, and it was super confusing because on the one hand, I was learning a ton, but on the other, it was a pretty challenging experience. So through this experience, I learned really strong design skills, but perhaps more importantly, I learned what kind of mentor I never wanted to be. So the lesson I really learned here was find a great mentor who teaches you hard skills, but who is also emotionally mature enough to teach you the soft skills. And it really helped me understand the balance between, what it means to have really good hard skills and how important it is not to be a jerk at work and actually have real soft skills and have empathy for those around you. So during the same time, I started writing a blog about design. Flash was still a big thing, and HTML5 was just being born. And there was so much innovation, so much creativity. There's this time during the design, it was almost like this Cambrian explosion. Like nobody actually knew usability patterns and nobody cared. It was just like these random apps were popping up. People are learning how to design for the iPhone. Like it was just, things were happening all over the place. And it was super innovative. I wouldn't necessarily say it was super usable, but it was super innovative. And this blog was a way for me to stay current and also learn. So I was working like 60 hours a week at work and also designing and writing and researching. And I was working any project they would give me. I wrote constantly. I continued to learn about typography, the history of graphic design in the West, books on prototyping, books on industrial design. And about this time I met my future wife. But like my big learning journey actually came when I was around 24 to 26. Like that was like my design school actually. So what I found there was that hard work and deep passion pays off, period. They say that mastery takes, 10,000 hours. That can be debated. But in my experience, at least, there's no easy path towards becoming a good designer with good skills. You just have to put in the time and energy and effort, learn the tools, and practice the craft. So I eventually led the design of the entire set of entire Adobe apps. So I was a lead designer on Fireworks back in the day. I don't know if anybody here remembers Fireworks or used Fireworks, but it was a really, really good tool. It was basically like Figma, but it had some features that Figma still doesn't have, which I loved. But anyway, but it wasn't online. And then I also worked on Flash Catalyst, which was not a very good tool, and it was discontinued. And then I worked on a tool called Adobe Muse. So I led these 3 design projects as the lead designer. I also took on consulting projects to gain more experience. So what I was doing in that process was building up my own personal portfolio. And every 6 months, I would look back upon my work and I would question, is this good? Do I think this is good work? Is this work demonstrating growth? And behind every project was a story. And for every story, I would ask, does this demonstrate that I have gained new skills? And do the new skills and growth that I've gained with this project open up potential new opportunities in the future for me? So that's another lesson that I'd recommend for everybody here, which is always look back upon your work periodically to assess whether you're on the right path and whether the work that you've done, the portfolio of work that you've accumulated, opens up future paths for you. And one thing I'll just say as a side note, the reason why I took on side projects is because I felt like my portfolio wasn't growing at the rate that I wanted it to. So I chose side projects to get more experience outside of work. I liked the project, I was paid for it as well, but it also grew my portfolio and grew my experience. Okay, at a certain point, my director asked me to manage a small team of 5. This was a crucial juncture in my career. I'd always wanted to manage and I was ready for this challenge. So the reason why I wanted to manage was first and foremost, I saw this as a way to increase the span of my creative direction. Because as an IC, you can work on 1 to 2 projects max, but as a manager, you have the opportunity to take on even more projects. And it's 100% my belief that accountability for design quality, like the thing, that software that you bring into the world, starts at the top and works its way down to the individuals in the team. So we're all accountable, but if you're at the head of an organization, like you are accountable for the success of all of these projects. And I've always believed that. So as a manager, I was really interested in basically having this portfolio of projects that I was accountable for. And I'm also super curious and I like to learn. And the more projects that I was working on meant that I connect the dots between the projects and find these interesting ways for them to kind of work together. It also meant that it would be more fun because I'd be doing more design. So I also care deeply about people, and management gave me this new opportunity to learn, because at least when I was starting out as a new manager, it was like you know, these 5 people that like have their own different goals and different values and different motivations and different needs. And it was a real challenge, like trying to understand that, because I was, you know, oftentimes just thinking from my own perspective. Now I had to think from the perspective of others on the team. And so Adobe didn't offer many management courses at the time. So I dove back into books to learn more about how to do it. I started reading this book called the Enneagram, which I would suggest to anybody if you want to kind of learn about people's personality types. I read High Output Management, which is a book by Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, which if you ever wondered where the term OKR came from, that book. And then I also, I mean, these are a set of books that I really liked. Creativity Inc. was a great book because it sort of showed how at Pixar, you could lead high sort of quality design teams and different innovative management process to bring creative individuals together collectively. So as a first-time manager, this was a huge S-curve for me, and I really put my heart into this. And it was a challenge, but what I really loved is I was able to put this sort of learning into practice immediately with my team, and I felt like a student again. It was great. It was getting paid to learn all over again. So after a few years, I was given more responsibility. I took over the design leadership of the entire Creative Suite team. It was a much larger team, around 21 people. And I started working with a design ops team as well. I got closer to the executive business leadership team. I started to learn more about how business impacts design, started managing managers. During this time, my wife and I had our first and second child, so we were starting a family. And my last project at Adobe was to transform the Creative Suite into the Creative Cloud. That was a fun and massive project, and it allowed me to really get closer to our business team, because this was about moving from a shrink-wrapped sort of business model into a subscription business model. Not a lot of UX, or sorry, not a lot of UI, it was a lot of UX and how to transition people from a different way of paying for a product. So I grew super close to the product team in that process, all while building and motivating a design team. But as that project moved on, I noticed something interesting. I was becoming a little bit frustrated with Adobe. I was super hungry and I wanted to take on more, and I was still on that upward swing of that S-slope, that S-curve. And, you know, the organization at Adobe was moving slower than my ambition. And at the same time I was feeling this, the VP of the team at the time was experiencing distinct frustration with our business counterparts. And he regularly voiced his frustrations about the product team with the design team and was transparently cynical. And I'll just be honest, like I have a hard time with cynicism. I just really don't like it. I believe that if you don't like something, you should put in energy to change it and try to be optimistic. And if that doesn't work, then you should speak with your feet and leave. If you can. I mean, sometimes it's challenging to leave. In this market, there's a lot of opportunity, so it's a lot easier now than it was then. But oftentimes, you know, if you're going to spend your energy, you want to make sure you're spending in something that you are optimistic about in general. So I felt a pretty big disconnect between my team's leader and my own values. And so this helped me learn to listen to the anti-patterns. So I believe that you can learn as much from the anti-patterns, just like with that mentor who was, you know, pretty unkind to me. You can learn as much from the anti-patterns as you can from positive patterns. And those anti-patterns can help teach you what not to do. If it's happened to you and you really don't like it, then in the future, you'll never do it. So I found that to be pretty useful. So I remember at this time distinctly, I was sitting at a cafe in Adobe. There's this really nice wooden bench. And I started to map out those paths. Like, what might I want to be 10 years in the future? And, you know, I was writing things that even I thought were unrealistic at the time. So head of design at Lego, VP of design at Apple, VP of design at Google, landscape architect, professional ceramicist. I just wrote it all out there. And then I decided to go out and learn what skills and experience I needed to do those kinds of jobs. Just like back in the day when I was trying to learn what it meant to be an architect. So I emailed people, I stalked their LinkedIn profile, and I started to network. And one thing I was sure of though is I needed more experience at a different company environment. I had maxed out my learning at Adobe at the time. And so the lesson I learned from this is take time to map your career path. I think it's something that we should do always, no matter where you are in your career. It's useful to actually take a step back, think about where you want to be in 1, 3, 5, 10 years. If you're really early on in your career, it may be challenging to think about where you want to be in 20 years, but I do this exercise now. I think about where I want to be in 1, 5, 10 years. And it's, you know, it's a top of mind sort of thing that I always keep with me. Okay, so I chose to move at that point to Google. This was 2011. They were actually starting to do good design. There was this like black header bar with your, it was called Kennedy. There's like this, the typography was getting better. It's like something has changed. The logos weren't as hideous. So something was brewing there and I kind of wanted to be a part of it. So I joined what was called the geo-commerce team, geo and commerce together, as a senior design manager, leading Google shopping and offers. My first impressions of Google were that they had really good product managers, incredibly good engineers, and like, interestingly, I thought really great HR policies, which I won't go into now, but I got really into like the way that they did HR. I also learned the pain of commuting. My family lived in Oakland and I was expected to be in Mountain View every day of the week. Traffic was horrible. It wreaked havoc on my schedule. It was physically exhausting for me. It was physically and mentally exhausting for my wife because she had to take care of 2 kids while I was stuck in traffic and at work. And even then she gave me support. And when I got home, you know, I gave the family attention, but what worked for my wife and I was that our values were aligned and we were there to support each other. And this is just a lesson outside of work. This is one life lesson, I guess, that life is easier when you and your partner share the same values. So I'm not here to be a marriage counselor, but like, it's pretty important. So about a year into my time at Google, they did a big reorg and Google was constantly reorging and for good reason. Like a company of that size needs to stay flexible and nimble. And so to do that, they have a culture of adaptability. And that allows them to quickly respond to pressures, internal and external. So they basically took the shopping team and they put it into the ads organization. And then the rest of the commerce and geo teams stayed together. And so this was a challenge for me because of all the product areas that I worked on, I really loved shopping. And so that was a challenge because my manager, who was a great mentor, was sticking with the geo commerce team. And I also really loved my manager at the time. So I needed to choose between a cool project or stick with Bobby. And this was a real challenge for me. It was my decision to make. Nobody else could make this challenge. So I talked with all the VPs and SVPs across the teams. I wrote lists of pros and cons, I took long walks, I talked with my wife about it, I talked to my parents about it. I couldn't decide. And it was the strangest thing. I basically had a nervous breakdown because I had this decision to make and I couldn't do it. In fact, it came down to the day of the reorg announcement and I still hadn't decided. And ultimately, out of fatigue more than anything else, I chose to stick with my manager. And looking back upon that now, I never have had decision fatigue after that, because what I realize now is that if you have 2 good options in front of you, the outcome will be positive no matter what you choose. So always try to have 2 good options in front of you. And that goes even for when you're thinking about like switching jobs. And you'll see later on in my career, I've typically always had 2 good options in front of me when I made a change in my career path. So I stuck with my manager. I left shopping behind, started work on Google Wallet and payments. And I did this for about a year. And if you've ever worked on payments, it can be dry when you start, but then it starts to get really interesting because it's so complex and so global and so impactful. And I spent a lot of time with my manager. I was learning and growing. I took a lot of Google's leadership training classes, which were excellent. They had courses on negotiation, leadership presence. My favorite, which was adaptive leadership methodologies. This book, Leadership on the Line, is one of those books about that. So I loved these learning opportunities because, again, I could apply them directly to my job. And I was growing and getting educated while I was working. I actually spoke at TGIF in front of the entire company, up on stage with Sergey and Larry at one point. And that was a huge highlight. I practiced that little speech for weeks, literally videoing myself and working to perfect it. I was so nervous, but it was like another like little challenge to like push myself into. And guess what? There was a reorg that happened. And after that reorg, shopping came back to me. Basically what they did is they created this new commerce group where travel and payments and shopping were all together in one group. So the love, my love of e-commerce was now back with me again. And through this experience, I learned that in business and in life, the only constant is change, really. I had spent so much energy concerned about losing the shopping design team, and now it was back to me again. And the world is always changing. And I think as long as you're growing, you create more opportunities to do more of the things that you love. And sometimes you can't really plan for the change to land exactly where you want it. But in this case, it landed in a good spot for me. So now I was managing an org of about 90 people, and I learned to manage at scale. I grew a team of high-performing managers, and our team was performing really well, and we were humming. But after a year and a half of this, I discovered that I wasn't deeply engaged or happy. The problem was that with a team of my size, I was spending more time in design and operations and communication than actual design. And while I was really good at doing that kind of stuff, ultimately I'm a designer at my heart. So that's what I love, and that's where I do my best work, and it's where I get my energy from. And so the lesson I learned there is from time to time, it's useful to list out the things that bring you joy and energy and use that list to help craft your experience and understand your experience at work. So I started networking with people at Google and trying to learn about different teams. And what I learned is that of all the teams at Google, I was actually on the team that I wanted to be on. So that helped me make a decision. I've been at Google for 4.5 years. And so my family and I were able to build up a little nest egg, and I felt secure leaving. So my wife was supportive, and I was mentally and physically ready for a new challenge. So I made the jump to Uber for a number of principled reasons, most of which turned out to be false. but that was a big jump. I started at Uber leading the growth design team as a design director. There were 25 of us. So I basically took this pretty big downsize in my responsibilities. It made it easier for me to adjust. And I was able to leverage all of that management technology I learned at Google and apply it to the smaller team. So I went from spending the majority of my time communicating with hundreds of people across Google to get the smallest feature shipped to actually being in design crits with my team and like diving into the design. And I loved it. My first 9 months at Uber was intense. I learned a ton. I traveled the world. We often would go to, I headed the growth team. So international growth was a big thing for us. I spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia, in Manila, in India, in China. And it was fantastic, just traveling the world and feeling the energy of the different cities and the different teams in the cities. And the camaraderie was palpable. So at Uber, you know, it was constantly reorging itself as well because it was growing so quickly. And eventually, after a number of major reorgs, I found myself leading most of the product design team at Uber, other than Uber Eats. And I think the reason why, and when I say I found myself in this role, I wasn't looking for it. I basically found myself in this role because I had this background in management training and leadership technology that I had learned at Google. And so I was able to take that past experience and basically make better and faster decisions about the design team's operations, organizational model, hiring practices, team culture, and team development opportunities. And so in this role, I started to focus on changing Uber's overarching culture. A researcher on my design team did an internal research project within the women of Uber design, and she found that there was super low NPS, and women were very not having a good time there. So I dug in deeper, and it turned out the issues were much more related to their experience of teams outside of design. So I raised this with my boss, who raised it with the COO, who basically ignored it. So I raised it again, and again, no response. So finally, I pushed it to our CTO, who was more responsive. And it turns out that during that time, he was faced with the sexual discrimination issues raised by Susan Fowler. These issues just weren't public yet. So with the CTO's blessing now, this is a different actually chain, not my boss. It was like a different exec. I took an initial step to start to remedy this issue. And I basically started Uber's first unconscious bias training program. But I was only able to do this within the design team. And so Uber's culture was systemically broken, and this was a small step to improve it. But to be quite honest, I was pretty frustrated with the executive leadership team that it didn't take this issue more seriously, because the women on my team were in pain. There was a systemic issue in the culture of Uber, but it just wasn't really being sufficiently addressed. So soon after the Delete Uber movement happened, and then soon after that, the Susan Fowler went public with her revelations about her experience with sexual harassment and discrimination. And it's an understatement to say that these back-to-back incidents just destroyed the morale of the people at Uber. Many, like me, were frustrated and really irritated with our CEO, Travis Kalanick, TK at the time, and the culture that he created. And you could kind of see people walking through the halls like zombies. Like we were really depressed and kind of shell-shocked. And it wasn't really getting better, for me at least. Every time I would see TK on stage for all hands and speak in those weekly company all hands, I was getting frustrated because he was just being more of himself. And I was like, this is making it worse. So I decided at that point that it was time to leave. And I also learned that Like it or not, your CEO sets team culture. So learn more about your CEO before joining the company, because even though you can have an impact on the culture, you can't change it unless the CEO wants it to change. That's at least my experience. So I made a commitment to myself to put the team in a much better place. I elevated some leaders so that when I left, the team would be secure. And I really learned a lot from this challenge, because I learned to be optimistic and authentic with my team. Even when I was personally really depressed and looking to move on, I just knew that I needed to get the team into a better spot. In adaptive leadership, that's a notion called getting on the balcony, where you kind of look objectively at the scene in front of you versus try to involve your own emotions. It's almost like a Buddhist mindset as well. And I found that really effective in my job when things are really, really challenging, to get on the balcony, remove the emotions from the scenario and look at things as they are and try to learn from them and understand them as they are. So for this, I learned a new lesson that every challenge, especially the big ones, are really learning opportunities, even though they might be very painful. Okay, so at this time I was interviewing at both Airbnb and Google. I made up my mind to leave Uber. And I actually received offers from both of these companies. And remember, it's always good to have two good options, right? That's the right place to be. So again, it was decision time. So when I made my decision, I had the opportunity to meet with Brian, and he's a designer himself. He inspired me during his meeting. He has a ton of energy, and he pushed me in new directions in that first meeting. And I learned a lot about his deep conviction for design, and design being central to his company's success. So I made the decision to join Airbnb. I'm super glad that I did. Especially coming out of Uber, Airbnb offered kind of this cultural cleanse. It was about as opposite of Uber's culture as you can imagine. But when it came to ambition and like focusing on working hard, Airbnb was right up there. So my first big test at Airbnb was managing this massive cross-company project called Tomorrowland. And I was the DRI, the directly responsible individual for that project, which meant that I worked across the entire company to share and plan for the event, get teams on board, make sure they were working according to schedule, actually change product roadmaps across teams so that we could build things for that event, and then bring it all together in a massive public event coupled with a significant press release. So this project pushed me in a lot of new ways and really hard ways. I was working directly with Brian, and I learned from him every second of the way. I learned about his leadership techniques, the way that he motivated people, the way that he focused on design. I mean, he is a design genius, and his highly collaborative and highly competitive nature. So I learned all of this from him almost firsthand. I also grew as a leader. People look to me to make very high level decisions, not just about design, but about the business and about our operations. And it was really hard work. I often stayed super late and I worked over the weekends. Sometimes I loved it. Sometimes I really resented it because I wasn't able to spend as much time with my kids and my family. But when it launched, I was so satisfied. It just felt like we finished an Ironman triathlon. And I also improved myself as a key leader, not just design, but a key leader at Airbnb. Somebody who, the CEO could trust and who could rally to make big things happen. So for me, that was a really big lesson. And my current boss has talked about this as well, which is, when you join a new company, it's really important to seek to get some early wins, because that really, again, if you think about the pathways, having an early win at a company and working really hard at that early win sets you up for greater internal opportunities down the line. So that project set me up for the next big opportunity, which was to lead the guest team as a general manager. So it wasn't just the guest design team. I was leading the entire homes design organization, but now in addition to that, I was the general manager for the guest team. So I was responsible for all functions: engineering, product, design, research, finance, and marketing, to ensure that the guest experience, the home's guest booking experience and search, was top notch. So this was by far and away the biggest challenge of my career. It was frankly hard to believe that I was being trusted with the keys to the business. So I served in this role for 9 months. I spent the majority of my time recruiting and building a leadership team. I established and hired new directors for product management, data science, and engineering, and also design. With the right team in place, I really focused on building team trust and improving conditions for the entire team to operate. I also focused on the business side. I fielded talks with key partners and M&A targets. I was in meetings with Ken Chenault, the CEO of Amex, to talk about deals. It was like, what am I doing in this meeting? Fake it till you make it, I guess. I also helped steer strategy and planning, and I was on the hook for the team's performance. So when our booking numbers went up, I was on the hook. When they went down, I was on the hook. So it was just a massive role that allowed me to grow in so many different ways. One thing that I learned though is that, in this new role, I had to look across the entire team and work with a diverse set of people. And I found that it was pretty darn stressful as well. I took work home with me every night because there was deep people problems that needed to always be solved. And I needed to prepare for the next CEO review or make sure my engineers were really happy and that they didn't quit, because ultimately you need engineers to build software. I also found that, interestingly, design wasn't the most important thing in my life. Like, it really wasn't. Across the week, I basically spent 2 to 3 hours on design-related topics. I was becoming a product person. And when I looked at myself in the mirror, I was like, who is this person? It was both fascinating and it was also scary. And it opened to my eyes to how product leaders often think. So design was important, but a solid product strategy was also important. And most of all, that happy engineering team was like non-negotiable. So I was on the other side of the table now, and I gained this new perspective and a new appreciation for all of the trade-offs that our product leaders oftentimes need to make. So after 9 months in that role, I decided it was time to come back to design. It was a transformative experience, and it solidified, though, my love and my commitment to design. So I know myself now better for that experience. And I know that while I can do that kind of job and lead large cross-functional teams, I would far prefer to spend my time with designers doing design and using design as a means to influence company strategy. And this taught me that learning what you prefer not to do and actually doing that can oftentimes help you learn what you love to do even more. And I'm not quite sure if I actually said this lesson right, because there's a lot of loves in there. But anyway, I love design and I learned that. So the last chapter of my career is Slack. Airbnb was a wonderful company, but I joined Slack not because I was running away from Airbnb, but I was really excited for the opportunity at Slack. At Airbnb, I saw the sea of aubergine. People were using Slack across the company, and I heard about its reputation as a product that people love. And I personally also loved working with it at Airbnb. And if you remember back, I went to grad school for information design. So I'm kind of a data and information sort of geek. I think about the social life of information, and Slack is basically this living, breathing information ecosystem. So I find it super fascinating from that standpoint. Also, I had worked for commerce for about 10 years at Google and Uber and Airbnb. And I really wanted to get back to building tools like at Adobe. I also met with the CEO. So I spent time with Stuart to understand who he was, and also my boss, Tamar. And I learned enough about them to believe that they really understand design. And Stuart specifically is really, really interested in design. He is as much of a designer as a product thinker. He's very good at both, and he's very different at both than what I was used to. And so I've learned a lot from his different way of thinking about design and product that has been unique in my career. At Airbnb, I had a team, Homes Design, that was within the greater design org, and I appreciated that. But it was, I basically had to align with a lot of programs and initiatives and sort of policies that were put in place by the greater design org. And I was really interested in sort of personally crafting an organization that was operating in a way that I felt was the best based on all of my experience. So I saw Slack as an opportunity to put that into practice and work with the design team at Slack to cultivate a culture and a team that, it was basically kind of from the ground up. So Slack gave me the opportunity to make decisions and build the team around that vision. And lastly, this is super important. All those years of climbing and challenging myself, I wanted to work somewhere finally that where I kind of knew how to do the job, because I'd already had done it elsewhere, at greater scales and smaller scales. And in other words, I wasn't at this point in my career looking for a radical challenge. I was actually looking for a job that felt more like a lateral challenge. And Slack offers this incredible work-life balance. We kind of have this saying, work hard and go home. And that's something that Airbnb couldn't really offer. It was kind of like work hard and then work harder and work on the weekends and then work more on the weekends. So my first few months at Slack, I was able to finally coach my son's soccer team. And I've never been able to do something like that before. Nor did I feel like my employer genuinely supported it. At one point I asked Stuart, like, hey, we're in this meeting. I need to go coach my son's soccer team. He's like, what are you doing here? Get out, like leave the, he was like, get out, leave the office. And after all, time is our most valuable currency. So we can't get any more of it. They don't make any more time. So I try to live every moment to its fullest. And so that's kind of where I'm at this point in my career. So if you look at those cycles, this is kind of what it looked like. sort of the first 2 years, grad school and before grad school. Then Adobe was a big sort of 10, almost 11-year cycle. Then we had Google, which was pretty rapid. It was 4.5 years, shorter than Google, but much longer than Uber and then Airbnb, 2 really rapid growth cycles. And then I'm at Slack. And who knows what the future is going to hold. I mean, I do actively make time to think about the next 5 and 10 years. I might want to be a career coach. I might want to advise companies more. I really love ceramics. I could potentially become a ceramicist at some point. What I do know is that I want to be an attentive father, and my kids are entering in their 2nd decade. So I want to be there for them, and I want to be there for my parents. So that's one of my #1 priorities as well. So there you go. There's my last 23 years of my life and my career. So hope this presentation was helpful for you to see one life path for somebody like me. And I'm always happy to share more. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ethan. And I just want to say that, I'm incredibly grateful, and I'm sure all of us here are as well, that you're sharing such a personal story with all of us here. And so, Ethan, I want to, give the time to the community who is spending time with both of us here today on this chat, and specifically on your presentation. So we have prepared a Slido set of Q&A in which the community has voted some of the questions in which I think it's pretty interesting. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to pick some popular questions there to get started. So the first one is from an anonymous. So Ethan, you mentioned about mentorship, right? And you probably have a lot of mentors, throughout your amazing journey. What are some of what is the best advice? What is the one piece of best advice you received from a mentor, and what was the worst one?
So mentorship is interesting because I've had different mentors at different phases within my life. So there's a few ones that have stuck with me. One was don't sweat the small stuff, which I thought it's a really interesting piece of advice, but I also have to think about where it came from. So that person was very, very senior. So to them, what small things were definitely like much larger for me at the time. So I was like, what does it actually mean for somebody to be small? And that's very subjective. But I've taken that piece of advice to kind of help me get through challenging situations. And then the other one came from my last manager at Uber, actually, he was really blunt and honest with me. He said, I think you're a great design leader, but you're handicapping yourself in your career because you haven't leaned in and made as much of an influence on product. And, I realized then that if I wanted to grow more as a design leader, at least in the companies that I was interested in, it was important for me to actually understand business a bit more. So I got some books. There was a Harvard business book. It was a visual book on finance, and it was actually pretty good. And I learned a lot about why accountants think so much differently than designers, and why accountants make decisions or financial people make decisions on risk. It's very linear, and it's an important part of a business because it's how business run. It's fundamental. There's certain rules around business that are fundamental that oftentimes as designers we don't really know. And we don't really care because we don't know how important they are. But when we learn about them, it just gives us this additional superpower to be influential when we're working with folks across the business. So that was another big piece of advice.
Thanks, Ethan. And I'll plus one to that. Having business knowledge as a designer is incredibly important. I think one book I would recommend, just on top of my head, when you shared that, is The Psychology of Money. I think that everyone should read that. It's an amazing book as well.
Is that the Morgan Housel? Is that Morgan Housel's book?
Yes, by Morgan Housel.
Yeah, I read that about a month ago. A really great book, super engaging, very easy to read. Really fantastic book.
Amazing. Awesome. All right, let's move on to the next question. I think this is quite an interesting one. So what are 1 to 3 key insights you learned as a lesson that is contrary to the leadership books? I believe what May is trying to say here is that you read multiple leadership books, but what are some of the things that the book has mentioned but is contrary in real life?
Let's see. One, I don't know, this is not what the book actually says, but it's basically how the book is written. Most leadership books are written like shit. So like, write a good leadership book. I don't know if that's contrary, but it's like contrary to the way that leadership books are typically written. Let's see, what is an insight that you learned that's contrary from leadership books? I mean, I can't really say, honestly, I can't really highlight one. What I would say is the reason why I can't highlight it is that most, take what you read with a grain of salt and think about what you read as, mere opportunities to believe them. Like it's not, you don't need to believe everything that you read. Not everything you read in these leadership books is going to be directly applicable. So it's important to be a critical thinker and understand who the author is, where they're coming from, what their goals are. And then it's up to you to interpret that and to apply it in the way that you want. So I can't really say that there's a counter insight or a false insight that I've experienced. It's really been more that I've harvested the perspectives and I've tried to apply them, but through my own lens and make them my own.
Thanks so much for that answer, Ethan. Like just from what you just said, basically, really trying to understand things from different contexts and then putting them into perspective is so important, not just taking that word for word. So thanks for sharing that. I think that's an important lesson by itself. All right. The next question. What's the biggest career mistake you have made? Oh, I think it's an interesting one.
Yeah. I think the biggest career mistake I made was mismanaging an assignment at Uber that it was the flow of communication and the way that I managed the cascade to these two individuals, put them in a position where they were both confused about what role they could inherit, and they both wanted the same role. And it ended up with them being both slightly dissatisfied. And I think in that one, I just wasn't as experienced in terms of like understanding how the path would unfold based on the way that I framed up the information, the strategy around communication. And that's part of what comes with experience, is that you've made these mistakes so many times in different ways, or you've seen things play out. And as a leader and a manager, oftentimes your role is to frame up scenarios for folks so they can understand and you can relate to them so they can hear the message in a certain way. And so I think I was, I wasn't equipped for that one, and I made a big blunder. And neither of them left the team. It's just that one of them left much more dissatisfied than they otherwise would have. They joined a different team, and they were more dissatisfied than they would have been if I had been a better communicator.
Thanks for that, Ethan. And I just want to follow up with one question that's not listed here from that, is that, through your careers, obviously, like, you made this mistake as like part of your career, but, what is like the toughest decision you have to make as a leader? Not just a design leader, but as a leader. What is the toughest decision you have to make?
The toughest decision?
Yeah.
That's an interesting one. I mean, I think a very important decision you need to make is who you promote. That's like, I wouldn't necessarily say it's necessarily the toughest one, but it's one of the most important ones, because who you promote is a direct reflection on what you value. And so as a leader, if you set your mission and values, and you establish those, it really comes through in like who you recognize within an organization. And so for me, the performance process and the promotion process is something that I really, I really focus on that. For me, it's one of the most important times that I can come together with the leadership team, and we do something called calibration, where we talk about everybody across the team and how we're doing, and it helps all of the managers learn from each other, and we can basically get on the same page. And then, the really tough decisions are like, well, how do we want to express our values in real action? And one of the key ways to do that is to recognize folks who are bringing those values into work on a regular basis. So that promotion process is really critical.
Thanks for that, Ethan. So I want to go to one question in which I thought was quite interesting, and I believe would be very personal to you as well, which is how do you balance career with family and personal life? I know that Ethan, you mentioned a lot about your family and especially your wife. You're definitely a family man, so thank you for that and shout out to you. So what are things that you do to balance career with family and personal life?
Well, so I haven't always done that, as you can kind of tell from my career path. Like there were definitely times when I was absolutely not balanced. It was like radically imbalanced. But I had, for the most part, my wife's support. At a certain point when I was doing that commute down to Mountain View, she told me like, this has got to stop. And I ended up trying to move. I successfully moved my job to San Francisco for 2 to 3 days a week. I guess one way I do it is I have hobbies. I have things that I really like to do outside of work that compel me. So I like to cycle. I do ceramics quite a bit. I've got this is so typical to have plants and there's synthesizers in my office. And so I like to, it's kind of typical, but I enjoy that. And so what I found is that, I still structure my day. I still structure my day outside of my work. It's not like I just end work and don't know what I'm going to do. I basically set goals outside of work. So one goal that I had for the past few years is I want to sell ceramics. I want to become a professional ceramicist. So I really focused on doing better. And I got to a point where I looked at my pieces and I was like, these don't suck. These finally don't suck. The glaze finally is as good as I want it to be. And the form is satisfactory. And the mouth feel is good. The hand feel is good. And it took me a long time and a lot of iteration, a lot of work doing that. And then I went to a shop in Lafayette, where I live. And the person who owned the shop said, I would love to sell these. And I made my first sale. So that's this goal setting process is not something that ends at work. It extends outside of work. And that has really helped me balance work. And so I try to set goals to, wrestle with my son. He's 11. He still likes to wrestle. So it's not like I have a chart, how many days have I wrestled with my son, but if he says, Dad, let's wrestle, I'm like, hell yeah, I could go back and do some more work, but I'm going to not do that right now. It can wait. This is what's important right now.
I have a question. Are those ceramics for sale?
Here's a mug. This mug doesn't suck. I like this mug. It's a good glaze, a good matte charcoal glaze on a nice stoneware body.
Thanks.
No, the person who owns that store is on my case. She wants more ceramics, so I need to get back into the production process.
All right, thanks for that, Ethan. So I'm going to go on to the final 2 questions before we wrap up. So Ethan, it's incredible to see the teams that you've been a part of. What do you think set you apart to land such competitive roles?
I think this is that learning how to learn, being sort of critical and and just being really curious and thirsty for knowledge, I think is one of the most important things, because all the resources in the world are available to us. And the question is just, are we, allocating time and energy to gain and access them? And then the flip side of that, I guess, would be, just the hard work and the desire to kind of, get put in the hours. And I think as designers, we oftentimes have a bit of a privilege versus potentially other professions, because we tend to love what we do, and we actually have our personal identities wrapped up in design and in doing design. And so just that time and energy that you put into your job, I don't know if you all feel the same way, but when I'm actually designing, I have a visceral positive feeling that goes through my body when I can hit a harmonious layout, or an iteration feels like it's moving in the right direction. It physically feels good and it emotionally feels good. And so it was that combination of learning how to learn and then applying it to something that was already making me feel good, and then doing that a lot and not being as, I guess, concerned about putting a lot of that, a lot of the hours to do it. So I think those are the two things. And again, my design career started relatively late in my life. I didn't learn to use the tools when I was younger. I didn't go to a traditional design school. So that period of time when I was at Adobe and just, that really rapid spike, it was pretty hard, but it was also a lot of fun. I remember one day I was like learning more about how fireworks works. And I was just like having these crazy dreams about the tool. And like, I was literally dreaming about using fireworks and like what was capable and like what I would design next. It was all consuming. So I think that kind of obsession, sort of obsessive tendency combined with, the desire to kind of do more and get better helped.
Awesome. So everyone, don't just be passionate, be obsessed, and also, be extremely curious. In fact, Ethan, I sort of like can, I want to share a quick story on that, because I actually met someone who works closely with Brian from Airbnb, and he actually sits on the board of Brian. You might know him, Jeff Jordan. So I met Jeff a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him this question, and I said, you have worked with the founders of Airbnb, Pinterest, Instacart, and I say, what do you think is the commonality between all of them when they don't, perform in their job? And he said, you know what? Like they literally go to class. And I say, what do you mean by that? And he tells me that, they go to class by calling people. They become extremely curious. They just start calling people. And I feel like I sense that from you as well. And so I just want to share that story with everyone, because it's so like whatever you say is like so relatable across the board with all the top leaders as well around the world. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right. So yeah.
And by the way, I saw Brian do that too. Like Brian and TK did that too. Like they would basically like meet people or hire people. What I saw them is they would hire people who could do something better than they could. Like they would hire somebody who's really good in finance or really good in like a certain part of business. And then they would learn faster than anybody from that person on their staff. And it was like they were kind of enveloping them with knowledge. And then but they did it really fast. And so then within like a month, Brian had gained all of this knowledge and insight, and he was able to apply that to a bunch of new areas. And it was pretty incredible to see that. And he does that with everybody. I mean, it's, he launched this new initiative with Obama. I'm sure he's been spending a lot of time with Obama, learning from Obama. Like, that's how he gets better. He's a constant learner.
I've seen that. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. So Ethan, before we wrap up, just one final question, and this is obviously like a little bit more personal to your career and however you want to put this. So, there are so many advice that you can give to the people today in the community who will be watching this. But what is one piece of advice that has stuck with you, like despite everyone or anyone that would disagree with that, but you will still commit to sharing this piece of advice to the rest of the crowd today? What is something that you strongly believe in as a human being?
I mean, I'm not gonna, let's see. This is gonna have some religious, I guess, overtones, but I believe that we should honestly like do to other people as you would like to have done to yourself. Like it is good to be empathetic and to expect of others what you would expect of yourself. I think that is a really sort of an important thing, because inherent in that is just this level of like and degree of empathy. And I think as a leader, just as a human, it's really important to take a look at who you are and what you would expect, and then bring that back out into the world and treat others with kindness and with empathy and with fairness, just like you'd like to be treated yourself. So for me, I think that's a really good rule. It applies in a lot of different ways, but I've always kind of held that really close to my heart, and I think it ultimately, if you follow that typical piece of advice, you end up being a pretty good person. It's kind of an important thing to be in the world. So
awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Ethan. That is really relatable to everyone here. So thank you, Ethan, so much for your time today. And everyone who has attended this session, with Slack and ADPList, incredibly grateful for all of the time to listen to Ethan and his story. I think this has been inspiring for all of us. And everyone here will get the recording next week. So you can message us. We'll be sending out, but we'll be emailing out to the entire committee at ADPList as well. So stay tuned next Tuesday for the recording. So thank you all so much for attending today's session. And thank you, Ethan, for spending your evening with us. I know you're going to go spend time with your family. So thank you. Thank you all so much for being a part of today's session. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Felix.